So let me just introduce this notion of philosophical stance, because I begin to think, okay, the ideas, the assumptions that I'm drawing from that I found valuable and important for me in the way that I think about and practice my work is that it's a philosophy of life. It's a philosophical position that one takes. And it's a philosophical position that one takes as a professional and in one's everyday ordinary life. That I begin to think that it's important to have some congruence and some coherence in terms of what we do, how we are in the world, how we interact, how we engage with others in both our professional and our personal lives. In other words, we shouldn't be one way in our everyday life and then put on a uniform or think we're going to perform a role as we enter the counseling or therapy room or the coaching or the consulting room. So again, I began to call it a philosophical stance. And as you said, ways of being, and what I've shifted this to is not only ways of being, but ways of being and becoming with another person.
Yes.
Because it's multiple ways of being, because whomever we're interacting with, what the occasion is, the context is, and all of those other factors influence what I think of as what's called forth from me, the particular way I will be with that person. And I added becoming because we are becoming together, each something different than we were when we walked into the relationship with each other.
Yes, yes.
So perhaps we can pause here.
Yes, yes.
And come back to this and then go into the features of the philosophical stance, which then begins to answer those important questions. But how do I do this? What do I do? What are the skills? What are the techniques? What's the method?
I like to say a little bit more about ways of being with, and also please. Multiple ways of being, because what you talk about, that is so rich itself. So I will talk a little bit more in Chinese. Yeah. 我非常喜欢刚刚哈令说的，就是我们每个人存在的方式不是只有一种。我们每个人都有多元的存在方式，我们可能在不同的情境，或是在跟不同的人，都会邀请不同的我们出来，所以不要去想说我们只有一种存在的方式。而且老师刚刚提到那个 with， 就是这种存在的方式是如何在关系里跟人们在一起。我觉得这种多元的视野，去看到说我们每个人都有很多不同的可能性，跟不同的人在一起，那我们可以如何去建构，如何去创造这个东西，特别的好玩，特别的有创造力，不会把人放在一个框框里，说我只能用这个模样去呈现。然后可能有时候人们在跟这个情境的时候是一个样子，在另外一个情境的时候也许是另外一个样子跟人们在一起，所以我觉得这种自我的突破、自我的成长是非常丰富的。然后前面他提到说那个理论跟实践是一致的，不是说我们讲了这个然后我们做的东西是分开的，这种一致性我觉得也是很可以去思索的。因为我们生活里面要去看看如何实践，然后我们要怎么样子让这个理论跟我们这个人是可以整合。我有一些学员会跟我说，他们很喜欢去找一些老师或是长者，他们那个人说的话跟他们表达出来的东西是一致的。所以我想那个一致对很多人都很重要。Talk about consistency.
Consistency in our lives and in our ways of being. That's very important.
Yes,
I appreciate your emphasizing that.
Yes, say something more. Okay.
So I think if we pause and we invite our viewers to do what we've been saying that postmodernism invites, and that is to step back and reflect on what you've been hearing and looking at as you've been viewing this video, and to think in terms of the conversation you've been having with yourself if you've been watching it, continuing to have a conversation with yourself if you're alone or if you're with others, to pause and join with each other in a conversation. See what appeals to you, what catches your attention, what makes you go, ouch, and what questions are emerging for you at this time.
Yes, that's a great idea. That's a great idea.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll now talk about a philosophical stance. This is a way of putting collaborative practices into action. I will cover 7 features that I call action-orienting sensitivities. These action-orienting sensitivities are intertwined, none stand alone, and they influence and inform the therapist in how to be and invite the client to be with them, a conversational partner engaged in what I call a mutual or a shared inquiry. In other words, the client and the professional are engaged together, doing something with each other. It's like they're in there together. So, in regard to mutual or shared inquiry, then sometimes the next question, Shishawani, is, well, how do you invite someone to engage with you in mutual inquiry, to be your conversational partner? And I have found some metaphors very helpful for me in my work, and one that I use in with my students back in Houston, Texas, is a metaphor of a host-guest. I have them in pairs talk with each other and share experiences about a time that they were a host and they had guests in their office, their home, their church meeting, their classroom. And what were those guests like? What did the guests do which made them feel like the guests respected their space? And most importantly, that the guests were not intrusive. For example, didn't go into their bedroom and look under the bed to see what was there. And then I have them switch, and I have them think about and share with each other, okay, think of a time that you were a guest in someone's home, someone's office, someone's meeting, and what was that host like? What did the host do that made you feel welcome? And most importantly, what did the host do that made you feel like you might be invited back again? So what I don't do is I don't give them a list of the characteristics of a good host or a good guest. I have them work with each other and they create their own ideas from their own experiences of what a good host and a guest would be like. So I say that when, as a professional, you're first meeting with a client, you have to keep this in mind. You're inviting them as the host into your space while at the same time you're a guest in their life. The other thing that I say to them is that when you think in terms of host and guest, think in terms of foreigners meeting each other. That for the people that we work with who come to us for therapy and counseling or coaching or consultant may not necessarily know what to expect. Now they may have seen something about these activities in movies or read something in books or magazines or the newspaper, but it's really like going to a foreign territory, a foreign land, where they don't know the language, they don't know the custom, they don't know the rules, they don't know quite what to expect. So it's very important to welcome someone in a way that you're being very hospitable and they are feeling somewhat less tense or awkward than when they arrived. Wonder if you have some comments, Shishawan, that you might like to add at this point?
I really like the host and guest metaphor. It's so helpful because when we look at our professional practice, we think about what we should do instead of thinking the way of our being. So this metaphor, I really think it's very inspirational to listen.
I think it's something that's practical that people can relate to in terms of what it's like to meet someone as a guest in their space or to host someone in your space. That's something that we've all done and do over and over again in one way or another.
Yes. And I think that you are using hosts and guests to invite people to look at actually collaborative practice. We already know some of the regular life. You use that metaphor to connect to collaborative, which I think is remarkable.
That's a very good point, because there are a lot of things about how you do collaborative dialogic practices that are things that in ways we already know, or we've learned how to do at some point, but sometimes we forget because we get in a hurry. We forget to offer someone a chair. We forget to offer them perhaps water or something else to drink, or ask them, did they have a lot of traffic getting here or find trouble parking? Something that helps to put the other person, your guest, at ease when they come into this very foreign land called the counseling room or the therapy room or the coach's office or the consultant's office. So then my students say, okay, well, we think we know how to be hospitable. We think we know how to be good host and guest. But then what? What do you do next to invite someone to be your conversational partner and engage with you in a shared or mutual inquiry? Well, I have another metaphor that I use that you've heard me talk about before, and that's the metaphor of a story ball. So I think in terms of the person that I'm working with, let's say the counseling or the therapy client, comes to me and is offering me a very precious gift. And I think of that gift as a story ball of the narrative fragments of their life.
Okay, so yes, we can.
This is the narrative fragments of their life. And it's almost as if their life has been written as a novel up until the point in time that we meet. And that unfortunately it has gone through a paper shredder, one of those things in offices where you shred paper and it looks like this so that no one can read it. So they come in with this, they've reached down on the floor and they've sort of picked it all up, scooped it up, made it into this ball, and they hand it toward you. So I say to my learners, I say, what you don't want to do is you don't want to take the ball from them. You want to reach out and gently touch it and gaze upon it, look at it, and begin to be curious about that part of it that they're showing you. And this is important, that part of it that they're showing you, that part of their story, that part of their life that they're telling you. Because if you think about it, if you look at a ball like this that we have up here on the screen, you know, it's round like this, and they're posing it towards you, and it's not opaque, it's not transparent, you can't see through it, you can't see all the way around it, you can't see under it, of course, you can't see on top of it. All you can see is what they show you. So that's what you want to begin to be curious about. You want to be able to learn about what it is that they're showing you. And it's important to have trust in the client that he or she knows what's important to tell you, how they want to tell their story, and when and where they want to pause and stop or repeat. Because each person that we meet with has a different manner, a way of telling his or her own story. So I think as therapists or counselors, we need to give up the idea, if we have this idea, that there's a way a story should be told. For example, we might have ideas that a story should be told in a chronological order, or that you only tell so much of a story and then you pause and give the other person time to speak. You know, we develop these ideas, which then we get in the way of the person telling their story the way that they would like to. And for me, that's the most important thing. Now, let's say that someone's telling their story and they say something that really catches my attention. So perhaps we can look at right here. So they're showing us this, and all of a sudden, some words or phrases or something they're telling me catch my attention. Okay, so then what I do is I don't interrupt them. I wait for a natural pause in the conversation, and I say, if you don't mind, a moment ago when you were talking, you were saying something about your grandmother who's in heaven right now. And I'm just really curious, is this something that would be important for me to know about? Would you like for me to know about it? Would you like for me to know more about your grandmother and your relationship with her and what brought her to mind as you were telling me about this life circumstance that the client's in my office about. So I'm doing two things. Number one, I'm trying to be polite and not interrupting them, and watching for the natural pause in the conversation. So that's also being respectful. And I also try to be polite and respectful by saying, do you mind? This is something I heard you say, and this is something that I would now like to ask you about. And I pay attention to how they respond to what I call my response to them. So someone may say, yes, as a matter of fact, my grandmother was a very important person in my life, and I do think she's really here with me now, and they may continue talking. Or they may just continue talking about what they were talking about as if I hadn't asked or said anything. And for me, that's okay. I don't interpret that as sort of denying the significance of the grandmother or trying to manipulate the therapy or all these different kinds of ideas that we could have about our ideas about how they should respond to us. So again, I don't place importance on those kinds of things.
It's like there's no one way of telling story.
No one way.
And then everyone has their own unique way of telling. And also they may be telling in different places, starting from different places.
Right, and sometimes people skip around.
Yeah.
They don't necessarily tell a story like a straight line, like you're reading a book, chapter by chapter. They may start with a piece of this chapter, and then skip to a piece of this chapter, go back to this one. They really kind of hopscotch around. So that reminds me of another metaphor that I use, is that I really think in terms of when I begin talking with clients, it's almost like we're in a helicopter. And they're sort of taking me all around, kind of looking at the landscape of their life or the particular circumstance, which is the reason for our meeting. And so sometimes they may take me over here and stay a while, and then they may zoop, 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 and then they may stay here a while. But it's like they're kind of exploring in a way, kind of feeling their way around, and in a way we're feeling our way around together. How are we going to be together? How are we going to be able to talk together and relate with each other?
It's like they are driving the helicopter. Yes, and they are the pilot, and you are the passenger.
The passenger.
And then wherever they drive to, you are with them, and then kind of just stay with them. It's not you are telling them you should drive there. You should drive there.
Right. I'm not the. What do they call it? The backseat driver? Do you use that term here in China?
Yes, sometimes.
Sometimes the person who's in the car with you telling you how you should drive.
Yeah, that happens.
And where you should go. Yeah. Yeah. So another way that I think about it is that when I start talking with a client, I think of it as the client's the teacher and I'm the learner. They're teaching me what they think is important for me to know about this particular circumstance or life event or pain or misery or tragedy that they've met in their life. And that I need to be curious and try to learn as much I can from what they're telling me, not from what I think they should be telling me. So then what I find is that over time, what I call sort of this one-way learning or this one-way curiosity begins to shift into a two-way learning, much like the metaphor of the helicopter with the client being the pilot, steering and guiding, that it begins to shift to the client and the therapist or counselor being the co-pilots, determining the route together and where they may pause and for how long. So this makes me think about questions, and I'm going to look at my notes just because I want to make sure that I don't forget something that otherwise I might be important. So I think in terms of questions as starting points for dialogue. So for example, another way of saying it is that as the therapist or the counselor, one has to speak to invite the other person to speak so that we can listen, and then we speak to make sure that we have understood or heard what the other person wants us to hear. And there are many ways of responding to invite the other person to speak or to help to clarify for you to learn more about what it is they're saying. It can be comments, it can be a nod, it can be any kind of gesture. But most common, I think, in our work is the question. So I always think in terms of questions is like starting points for dialogue. And they help facilitate a conversation. So I don't think of questions as being posed to be answered, but again, as questions or invitations. May we talk about this? Is this a possible way to talk about this? Do you mind if I learn more about that? So it's always a question with that attitude, that tone in mind that accompanies it. So questions are thought of as part of what might be called active listening or responsive listening, that you're listening to respond. And I think, as you said in the previous segment, the importance of maintaining some coherence with the person as you are talking with them, and that your questions have some fit with, some connection with what they're talking about. So they're questions that are informed by the conversation itself, or what I call conversational questions, rather than a list of questions that are brought in from the outside that have been predetermined or pre-structured in terms of what's thought to be the most important kind of information or data that one should get, based on pre-knowing.
Yeah. I have one phrase in Chinese.
Oh, what is that, please?
It's with, but I want to speak in Chinese.
Okay, please.
贴近，就是刚刚哈令老师提到，就是当我们以咨询师的想法去问，而是贴着来访者去看看他到底说的是什么，然后我们贴近他的思路、他的脉络去跟他说话。Because I want to use 贴近 the word to kind of comment on what you just said.
Okay, and to emphasize the notion of with and being with and close to another person's
and
story.
not the therapist's own thinking. It's close with the person. Okay,
so I'll have to have you write that word out for me. So,
okay, definitely.
So
I love those two words.
Okay.
贴近, it's
贴近.
Yeah, 贴近. It's always something like when I am working with people, having a conversation, I always think about how could I be with the person, how could I 贴近 in Chinese, 我如何贴近对方? It becomes something very sort of guiding metaphor for me.
Okay, so again, the being with, the being present, which I think you also mentioned in an earlier segment, being present with another person, which you can't really be present if you're asking pre-structured questions or filling out a questionnaire.
You have to really follow the person.
You really have to follow the person. But just to divert a moment, since I said filling out the questionnaire, is that I think that if you work in an organization or an agency or a practice where you're required to get certain kind of what's usually called social history or intake information, that you let the client know that this is a requirement of this clinic or this hospital, and that, if you don't mind, we have been requested to fill out this form. So I use the collective language, and I let them know that this is not something that I necessarily think is that important. I may or I may not, but that it's really an externally imposed request or command of us if they're to remain a client and I'm to keep my job. So and then that way it doesn't begin to get it doesn't begin to interfere, I think, with the relationship. Or they don't think that this is something that you think's important, that they don't think's important. It's somebody out here thinks this is important. It's a subtle distinction, but I find that it's very, very useful. And particularly when you're working with clients who are forced by someone, whether it's a legal authority or a school or an adolescent forced by a parent to come to therapy, to let them know that this is something that we are required to do.
Is this related to how this is related to the idea of public, being public.
Well, I'll talk about that. If you don't mind, if I can come back to that in just a minute.
Yeah, of course,
okay. So let me just a couple of more comments about questions. Okay. So I also have in my notes here that questions give energy to a conversation. They help a conversation continue to move forward, continue to move toward developing clarity in terms of what the client is talking about, to developing understandings, and therefore new understandings and new meanings. So as the professional is participating with the client in the conversation, it becomes this generative thing where you're both, again, mutually inquiring, kind of looking, putting your heads together. I call it wrinkling your brow, you know, when you're really thinking hard. So you're thinking hard together, but out loud, while, of course, each of us are thinking silently. And that with questions, it's not that we're looking for something that we think is already there. That can be a mistake, because when you look for something that you think is already there, most likely you'll find it. Or we could say most likely you'll create it. Yeah. Okay. So, in sum, questions, like any response or comment, are a way of participating in the conversation. They're a way of providing what I call food for thought and dialogue. They're not mandates. They're not pre-structured. They don't have pre-structured answers. It needs to be a much more spontaneous give and take and flow. So then the next, well, let me just say some more about the fragments.
Okay,
go to the next slide.
Okay. You want to go now? Or?
Yeah, go now. So, thinking in terms of the story ball, and I mentioned it as thinking of it as a precious gift that the client brings, and that I want to touch it, I don't want to take it from them, was at a conference in Taos, New Mexico. And you may have been at this conference. I'm sorry, I don't remember.
Yes, I was there.
I think you were. And as what they call in the States an icebreaker, where you have some kind of fun activity at the beginning of a conference, so people kind of loosen up and begin to talk to each other and begin to know each other. They had all of these balls of yarn in different colors, and they gave them to people around the room, and people started throwing them, tossing them across the room, and this was a very large room. So the ball would go across the room and, of course, unravel. So at the end, when everybody was leaving, there was all of this yarn on the floor. And this colleague of mine from Denmark, Karsten Harnstrup, picked it all up and walked over to me, and he said, "Here, Harlene, here's a story ball for you," because he'd heard me talk about this. And another colleague, Sylvia London, happened to be standing there, and she says, "Wait, I'll take a picture."
Oh,
yeah.
Wow.
So this is an example of a client handing me his narrative fragments, and I'm touching them. I'm not taking them away from him. And I'm looking at the camera here, but usually I would be looking at this, and I would wait for him to tell me where he wanted to start. Sometimes I might say, I might start with anything. Depends on kind of our informal talk beforehand, but I might say, where would you like to start? You said you wanted to talk about your son and some of the problems that you're concerned about because you don't think he's hanging out with the right teenagers. So where would you like to start? Or I might say, what are the most important things that you think I should know about this particular situation? So I try to ask a question which tells them that I'm interested in them telling their story the way they want to, not the way that I think they should tell.